Firstpost reports from the world's second largest continent. Hello, I'm Alison Lagrange. A very warm welcome from Durban, South Africa. We get you the news and the newsmakers from Africa. From elections to climate change to innovations and opportunities. As the world's attention shifts, we report from Africa, the heart of the global south. Join me every weekday live on Firstpost. Hello and welcome to Firstpost Africa, where we get you the top stories from the continent and from across the world. I'm Alison Lagrange, coming to you live from Durban, South Africa. First, let's take a look at the headlines. Nations worldwide, including China, the UK, Australia and Turkey, condemn Israel's Gaza takeover plan, approved by its Security Cabinet, warning of severe humanitarian consequences. Japanese warships dock in New Zealand's capital of Wellington for the first time in nearly 90 years, as Tokyo seeks to deepen its strategic ties in the South Pacific. Malaysia will lead a regional delegation to Myanmar next month after the junta lifted its state of emergency, with the mission set to assess preparations for polls planned in 6 months. The DRC president reshuffles his cabinet, appointing at least 2 opposition figures, as the Central African nation faces a mounting security crisis in its eastern region. And rainfall, described as never seen before, hits parts of southern Japan, with authorities urging residents to evacuate and warning of possible landslides. Hello and welcome. Let's take a look at our top story. US President Donald Trump returned to the White House in January, and since then he has been waging trade wars and slapping countries with tariffs and visa restrictions left, right and center, all in the name of making America great again. And a major part of his campaign has been re-evaluating America's partnerships across Africa. And his latest target is Kenya. Now, last year in June, Kenya became the first country in sub-Saharan Africa to receive the status of a major non-NATO ally. This status is given to countries that are not a part of NATO, yet have a deep strategic and security partnership with the US. The designation grants access to military financing, joint training, and priority defense equipment delivery, without binding the US and Kenya to mutual defense of each other. And now, just a year later, the Trump administration wants to review it. Why? It's because, just like South Africa, Trump is not happy with Kenya's foreign policies. Kenya's alignment with top American rivals like China, Russia and Iran has especially irked Donald Trump. Also on the list for review are Nairobi's alleged ties with terrorist groups like Al-Shabaab and the Sudanese paramilitary RSF. The review would also assess if the Ruto government has misused US security and intelligence support to engage in human rights violations, such as abductions, torture, renditions, and violence against civilians. Amidst all of these allegations and threats by the Trump administration, President Ruto has come to his country's defense. Though Ruto acknowledged America's dislike for growing Kenya-China ties, he said that trading with Beijing is Nairobi's best interests. Ruto cited the removal of tariffs by China on Kenya's key exports like tea and coffee as a reason for boosting ties with Beijing. Back in April, President Ruto met with Chinese President Xi Jinping in Beijing. There he hailed the two countries as co-architects of a new world order, prompting backlash from the US. Earlier in his presidency, Ruto had favored the West and the United States over China. The US is also one of Kenya's largest export destinations. But Trump's hardline trade policies and unpredictable actions have made Kenya rethink its stance. Trump has imposed 10% tariffs on Kenyan imports. The African Growth and Opportunity Act, which exempts Kenyan goods from tariffs when exporting to the US, is also set to expire in September. A no-good trade deal with the US is in sight as of yet. While Washington is growing averse, Beijing is offering help to Nairobi. China is Kenya's top supplier. Under Beijing's ambitious Belt and Road Initiative, China has funded billions of dollars worth of Kenyan roads, ports, and railway. Now, all these reasons are good enough for Kenya to pivot from the US toward China. And for more on this, we have with us Luke Anami, an international affairs expert who is joining us live from Nairobi, Kenya. Thank you for being with us on Firstpost Africa.
Thank you so much, Alison, and thank you for welcoming me to this program.
Thanks, Luke. Now, given President Ruto's emphasis on national interest and trade benefits with China, how might Kenya navigate potential diplomatic fallout with the United States, especially in light of its recent designation as a major non-NATO ally?
Yeah, first of all, it's very important that you put in context the reasons why Kenya is going to China. One of the reasons is, just as you put it clearly, is currently the tariffs that Trump has actually the tariffs that Trump has slapped on Kenyan goods make it uncompetitive to continue exporting goods to China. This is not very new. This is just something that Trump has actually been doing since he came in office. So Kenya is trying to, just like any other country that actually has witnessed Trump's extremes on tariffs, is trying to look for a market for its own goods, for its own survival. So that is the underlying factor that has made the president decide that he would like to do it. Now, on answering your question,
right.
It will be one of the things that the President Ruto's government is likely to do is that they are going to avoid a fallout with the U.S. So the first stop is they will take the first flight to Washington. And as I speak, I think the Kenyan Ministry of Trade and its delegation is heading to Washington 15th of this month, where they are going to discuss the potential of trade and maybe perhaps bring all these things on the table. The other factor is that you need to know that this issue has been brought out by a senator, a Republican senator, Senator James, who actually has just brought and is trying to move the idea that Kenya needs to be punished because it is actually working in close ties with China. But almost every African country right now is working with China. It will be unfair to punish Kenya and let's say you don't have, and other countries are still working with China because, even before the previous regimes, Kenya has always been trading with China. China has been constructing roads here, and we've never had the US government coming to say, hey, stop working with China and work with us. So I think the first decision is to ensure that this diplomatic fallout does not happen. And just as I've told you, the first flight for the Kenyan Minister for Trade is in Washington, D.C.
Right. But Luke, on that, the US review will examine Kenya's alignment with Washington versus its ties with China, Russia, and Iran. What possible outcomes could this review have on Kenya's international standing and its economic partnerships?
Yeah, first of all, let us look at the closer ties with the U.S. If Kenya is seen as aligning with the U.S. interests, it could lead to increased U.S. investment, aid, trade opportunities, and potentially strengthening its economy and international influence. But on the other hand, if the relations are strained, and conversely, if the review reveals closer ties with China, Russia, or Iran than with the US, it could result in reduced US support, including decreased aid, investment, and potentially even sanctions impacting Kenya's economy and international standing. So it would be critical that Kenya works so hard to ensure that this relationship is not strained. And even on the economic partnerships, the outcome is likely to affect Kenya's access to various economic partnerships. As you are aware that alignment with the US could easily open doors to more favorable trade agreements and investment opportunities, while perceived misalignment could lead to decreased access to US-led initiatives and partnerships. So it would also be impact on Kenya's international standing reputation, and therefore it would be important to move quickly before the findings are actually established.
Right. Luke, thank you very much for being with us on Firstpost Africa and for your valued insights there.
Thank you so much, Alison. You're welcome.
And as Ruto defends China ties, there is another player making headway in Africa, expanding its footprint from east to west, and that is Turkey. Now, in the latest, Turkey is warming up to the West African nation of Senegal. President Recep Tayyip Erdogan hosted Senegalese Prime Minister Ousmane Sonko in Ankara on Thursday. The two countries signed 4 agreements in defense, media and education. Both leaders discussed enhanced defense and security cooperation. Erdogan praised the growing interest of African nations in Turkish defense products and vowed to strengthen solidarity in the coming period.
Today, in our talks, we discussed cooperation opportunities with Mr. Sonko in areas such as investment and trade, security, the defense industry, the fight against terrorism, energy, mining, transportation, agriculture, and fisheries.
We have not yet fully explored the relationship potential between our two countries. And in all the sectors you mentioned earlier, agriculture, energy, and transportation, in what we are trying to achieve within the framework of Vision 2050, Turkey has a place alongside us as investors, as strategic and institutional partners.
La Turquie a sa place à nos côtés, en tant qu'investisseur, en tant que partenaire stratégique et institutionnel.
Turkey has in recent years emerged as a key player in Africa, consolidating its foothold at a time when many nations are turning away from former colonial powers. One of the most crucial areas is defense. Ankara has signed defense agreements with nations across the continent, including Somalia, Libya, Kenya, Rwanda, Ethiopia, Nigeria, and Ghana. These deals cover military training, intelligence sharing, counterterrorism support, and arms sales. Thousands of African military and police personnel have been trained by the Turkish armed forces. Turkey's largest overseas base in Somalia trains thousands of troops each year. The Turkish drones, especially the Bayraktar TB2, have become highly sought after for counterinsurgency and surveillance. At least 11 African countries reportedly now operate these drones. But the partnership goes beyond defense. Erdogan has made 53 visits to 31 African countries since 2004, more than any other world leader. Turkey has increased its embassies in Africa from 12 in 2002 to 44 in 2024, while African embassies in Turkey have grown from 10 in 2008 to 38 in 2024. Trade has also surged from $4.3 billion in 2002 to over $36 billion in 2024, which is nearly 9 times higher. Turkish investments in Africa have risen from $67 million in 2003 to $10 billion in 2024. By the end of last year, Turkish contractors had completed over 2,000 projects worth $97 billion. Another key front is mediation. Erdogan has tried to project himself as a peacemaker in Africa. He brokered a deal between Ethiopia and Somalia, diffusing tensions over a port agreement. Ethiopia has now appointed a new ambassador to Somalia, signaling the deal is holding. People-to-people and cultural ties are also growing through scholarships, development projects, and a wider diplomatic presence. Erdogan calls Africa the star of our century, with his youthful workforce, dynamism, and natural resources. He warns that no country with a global vision can ignore the African continent and dismisses critics of the partnership as trying to confine Turkey to shallow waters. But as multiple players push for influence, the question is, who will emerge as Africa's strongest and the most trusted partner? While Turkey is boosting its presence across Africa, former colonizer France is losing its grip over the continent. In recent years, French troops have been pushed out of West African nations like Senegal, Chad, Ivory Coast, and the Sahel nations. The shared anti-West sentiment has made the junta-led African nations turn to Russia for military support instead. France's fall from grace is not just limited to losing military presence in Africa. Its diplomacy is crumbling too. At the beginning of his presidency, Emmanuel Macron had an ambitious plan to reconcile France with its former colonies. But that appears to be a distant dream now, especially with Algeria. Relations between Paris and Algiers are turning from bad to worse. Macron has asked his government to tighten visa requirements for Algerian diplomats. The French government has suspended a 2013 agreement that exempted diplomatic and official passport holders from visa requirements. Macron has also asked for cooperation from countries in the Schengen zone to help France apply the tighter visa policy. And these are the countries that allow passport-free travel between their borders. Paris wants countries in the Schengen zone to consult the French government for the issuance of short-stay visas for Algerian officials and the passports covered by the 2013 agreement. Algeria has slammed Macron's tough measures, saying that France alone has pushed for the 2013 agreement. Retaliating to Macron's move, the Algerian government said it was ending rent-free arrangements for France's diplomatic mission in the North African country. The reason why Macron is growing frustrated with its former colony is Algeria's reluctance to take back its citizens who have been ordered to leave France. Ties between the two countries have plummeted since last year, and at the center of their poor relations is the disputed territory over Western Sahara. Last year, Macron angered Algeria by backing Moroccan sovereignty over Western Sahara, where Algeria supports Morocco's rival, the pro-independence Polisario Front. Another major bone of contention has been Algeria's imprisonment of the French-Algerian writer Boualem Sansal and prominent French football journalist Christophe Glazyes. Now, Paris has also accused the pro-Algiers influences of inciting hatred inside France. Back in April, both France and Algeria expelled diplomats after the arrest of 3 Algerian nationals suspected of kidnapping a high-profile critic of the Algerian government in Paris last year. On one hand, Macron is pushing for a tougher stance against Algeria. On the other, he says that he still wants to restore relations with the former colony. Now it remains to be seen how this escalating diplomatic standoff will further push France out of Africa. It's not just France. Countries across Europe are taking a hardline stance on migration, and the idea of third country deportation, that is, sending migrants to a nation they have no ties to, is gaining momentum. Rwanda has positioned itself as a key destination for such deportations. It previously tried to strike a deal with the UK. It has now sealed one with the US under President Donald Trump, and is now being courted by the European Union, despite the bloc's earlier opposition when it called such deals inhumane and unethical. Once dismissed as unlawful by European leaders, the idea of relocating asylum seekers to third countries like Rwanda is regaining traction within the European Union. This as political tides shift and anti-immigration rhetoric gains ground. Reports say the EU has drafted legislation to formalize third country asylum processing, including an EU-wide list of safe countries and new rules. This will allow member states to send migrants there, even without prior ties to the destination. Rwanda's name is emerging again in multiple European capitals, and it is hailed for its stability, governance, and ability to support migrant integration. Ironically, Europe once condemned this very model, which was the now scrapped UK-Rwanda migration deal. The plan sought to transfer asylum seekers from the UK to Rwanda for processing and resettlement. It was scrapped last year by the Keir Starmer-led Labour government. Yet today, countries including Germany, Italy, Denmark, and the Netherlands are actively exploring similar strategies. Germany stands out. The country that once championed refugee reception under Angela Merkel is now reportedly in talks with Rwanda for a UK-style arrangement. The Netherlands has been in talks with Uganda about setting up a transit hub, and Italy has signed a contentious deal with Albania and has already sent migrants. Beyond Europe, the US under Trump is actively deporting migrants to third countries. Rwanda confirmed this week it will take 250 migrants deported from the US. Washington has also sent migrants to South Sudan and Eswatini. Critics say the return hub model is a form of neocolonialism, turning African nations into dumping grounds for migrants. Then there are human rights concerns. Many of these nations have poor rights records, are politically unstable, or mired in conflict. As the EU mulls third country deportations, it is already funding migration controls in countries like Tunisia and Libya, where authorities have repeatedly been accused of human rights violations. This, as these migrants often end up in detention centres where they're subject to inhumane treatment and horrific crimes like trafficking and sexual abuse. As liberal policies fade and a hardline approach gains ground across the EU, it is time for the bloc to consider whether to keep preaching its ideals or instead focus on defining its own stance. And that's it on the show for today. We will see you again at the same time on Monday. Thank you for watching. Have a great weekend and goodbye.